Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a very odd corner of history. Not the wars, not the kings, not the shiny crowns. Tonight, we are going somewhere a little less glamorous. We're talking about what people did thousands of years ago to make sure they didn't have children when they weren't ready for them. Yes, contraception. Or at least what passed for contraception back, when people thought demons caused headaches and bathing too much would kill you. So settle in, dim the lights, take a slow breath. This is not going to be a high-energy story. Nothing explosive, nothing fast. Just a quiet, slow float through the strange and frequently alarming history of birth control. And of course, because this is human history, most of it didn't work very well. But people kept trying anyway, because they always do. Let's start gently in ancient Mesopotamia. The earliest known written instructions for preventing pregnancy appear on Sumerian and Babylonian tablets. Small clay rectangles, etched carefully with the knowledge of their day. Among lists of barley rations, contracts, and complaints about goats eating someone's grain, there are a few calm little lines about mixing things together and putting them where the sun does not shine. Literally. One recommended mixture was date paste, combined with acacia and honey, and inserted into the body. It's a surprisingly thoughtful recipe, sticky enough to stay in place, mildly acidic thanks to the acacia, and sweet enough to, well, probably to attract ants, which was less helpful. And yet, it shows that even 4,000 years ago, someone thought carefully about this. Imagine living in a hot mud brick house, goats braying outside, and taking time to prepare what is essentially a fruit and honey plug for contraception. Would you have tried it? Tell me in the comments if you would have gone with the date paste or just hope for the best. But let's drift along, because we're just getting started. Over in ancient Egypt, things got even more creative. Papyrus scrolls survive with recipes that range from maybe that would work, to oh no, that sounds like a terrible afternoon. One common Egyptian method was a pessary made of crocodile dung. Yes, you heard that right. Actual crocodile droppings. Because, of course, they thought that would help. The logic, apparently, was that it was thick, sticky, and alkaline. This might have changed the pH enough to create a hostile environment for sperm. But imagine the smell. Imagine the effort involved in harvesting the material. And then imagine being the person who had to use it. It takes a special level of dedication to family planning to go through with that. And if you think that's strange, Egypt had a few other recipes. Ground up acacia pods again, which would have released lactic acid, not bad signs of time, and mixtures of natron, which was basically ancient baking soda, used for everything from cleaning teeth to drying out mummies. If nothing else, the Egyptians were consistent. They liked things dry. They liked things salty. And they very much wanted to avoid surprise babies. Let's just slowly wander forward into time to ancient Greece. Because the Greeks naturally had opinions about everything, philosophy, geometry, and yes, birth control. One of their favorite solutions was silphium. Silphium was a plant that grew only in one narrow strip of North Africa, near Cyrene. It was so popular as a contraceptive that they literally harvested it to extinction. Yes, humanity's first recorded extinction by overharvesting was of birth control. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, complained that the last stalk of silphium was given to Emperor Nero as a curiosity, which feels about right. You can just picture Nero holding this rare, precious plant, probably wondering if he should eat it or set it on fire for fun. The loss of silphium was apparently quite a blow to ancient family planning. Nothing else worked quite as well, according to ancient writers. After that, the Greeks turned other herbs. Pennyroyal, Queen Anne's lace, rue, but many of them were toxic in the wrong dose. So, using them was a gamble. Maybe it worked. Maybe you got very sick. Maybe both. And yet, people kept trying because what else could they do? There were no latex factories, no hormone pills. Just trial, error, and a lot of uncomfortable evenings. By the time we reach ancient Rome, things started to feel a little more familiar. The Romans liked control. They liked order. And they definitely did not want too many heirs running around muddying up the family line. Roman authors mention withdrawal, abstinence during certain times of the month, and of course, herbal remedies. Some Roman physicians suggested sneezing after intercourse. apparently to shake things loose, as though the uterus might politely let go of its plans if startled enough. Other writers recommended jumping up and down or coughing very hard. It probably didn't work, but at least it got the blood moving. Roman midwives also used pessaries made from oils soaked in various substances, honey, vinegar, or even cedar oil. Soft little sponges, carefully placed. A strangely tender image in a world otherwise full of gladiators and swords. Tell me what you think. If you had to choose between crocodile dung, pennyroyal tea, or Roman vinegar soak wool, which one are you picking? I'm not sure there's a winning option here, but I'd love to know what you think. Let's drift onward, because the medieval period was waiting to make things worse. But we won't rush there yet. Let's linger a moment more in the Roman world, because it's oddly comforting to know they struggled with the same worries. They had their parties, their wine, their crowded bathhouses, but they still had to figure out who was going to inherit the estate and who wasn't. They still had to face awkward dinner conversations when someone's mistress turned up pregnant. They still wrote anxious letters to doctors asking if jumping up and down really worked. History is full of these tiny, very human details. And when you look closely, it's a little soothing to realize how little has changed. People have always tried to control the uncontrollable. Sometimes with science, sometimes with superstition, sometimes with crocodile dung. And that is where we'll leave things for now. Still in the warm Mediterranean night, with the quiet streets of Rome outside, someone carefully tucking a little wool sponge into place and hoping for the best. What do you think? Would you have trusted the Romans on this one? Or would you have waited for a better idea to come along? Tell me in the comments. Would you like me to continue writing parts 2 to 12 in the same flowing, uninterrupted paragraph format, slowly carrying the listener through medieval charms, Renaissance herbal guides, Victorian abstinence manuals, and the early modern birth control crusades, all in one calm, bedtime-friendly tone? So let's drift onward, gently leaving the quiet streets of Rome behind and moving into the early medieval world, where science was not exactly having its best day. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire came a long period in Europe where much of the medical knowledge was preserved only in monasteries, copied patiently by monks who may or may not have understood what they were writing. Birth control knowledge didn't vanish, but became tangled up with moral judgments and church teachings. Many early medieval texts warned that contraception was sinful, though of course that didn't stop anyone from trying. It never does. People still experimented quietly, in kitchens, in gardens, and in dark corners of the manor house. Herbs remained the most common approach. Pennyroyal tea was still in use, as well as mugwort rue and wild carrot seeds. These were all known as emmenagogues, herbs that encourage menstruation, which in theory would prevent or disrupt pregnancy. Some women drank them in secret. Others took them under the guidance of a village midwife, who often acted as a combination doctor, herbalist, and local gossip hub. These midwives walked a fine line, providing knowledge that was often frowned upon by the church, but still being called upon for births, healings, and blessings. It was a risky business, but someone had to do it. Medieval texts also recommended some very creative amulets and charms. One manuscript suggested carrying the womb of a ferret, carefully removed while the animal was still alive. Yes, a ferret, because obviously, if you wanted to avoid children, what you needed most was a pocket ferret womb. Other recommendations included tying certain stones around the thigh, wearing amulets with carved inscriptions, and reciting specific prayers during intercourse. If that sounds awkward, it probably was. Nothing says intimacy like quietly muttering a Latin charm halfway through. The church, of course, did not approve. Many theologians wrote stern warnings about contraception, saying it was unnatural or against God's will. Some even suggested that certain forms of birth control were equivalent to murder, which made the whole topic rather tense. But despite the moral pressure, medieval households had practical reasons to control family size. Land was limited, inheritance laws were strict, and too many children could be a disaster for a struggling farm. So the knowledge persisted, passed down in whispers and coded recipes, even as priests thunder from the pulpit. Condoms, of a sort, also made a quiet entrance into European history during this period. They were not the neatly packaged latex versions we know today. Instead, They were usually linen sheets tied on with ribbons, sometimes soaked in chemicals to make them less permeable. The earliest references come from Italy and England, where doctors were more worried about preventing syphilis than pregnancy. They were reusable, washable, and about as comfortable as you'd expect a ribbon-tied linen sock to be. Let's not forget that other parts of the world were also busy coming up with solutions. In China, medical texts describe using oil-soaked silk paper as a barrier method, a rather elegant approach compared to Europe's ribbon socks. In India, the Kama Sutra recommended pessaries made of honey, ghee, or rock salt, applied before intercourse. These methods were sometimes combined with timing strategies, though of course no one had a good understanding of ovulation yet. It was all guesswork, observation, and hoping for the best. You might wonder how effective any of this actually was. The answer is, not very. Pregnancy rates remained high, infant mortality remained higher, and families simply adapted. But that didn't stop generation after generation from trying new ideas, no matter how strange they might sound to us now. There is something almost comforting about that persistence, a reminder that the human urge to control our fate has always been there, even when the tools were crude. If you had to live in the medieval world, which method do you think you'd trust the most? The ribbon-tied condom? The pennyroyal tea? Or maybe you go all in and carry the ferret charm just to be safe? Tell me in the comments. I am genuinely curious which of these sounds least terrible to you. As we float onward into the late Middle Ages, we begin to see more written medical treatises attempting to codify this knowledge. University-trained physicians, usually men, started to write down lists of acceptable herbs, safe doses, and step-by-step instructions for pessaries. Some of these were surprisingly careful and practical. Others were bizarre mixtures of astrology, humor theory, and pure imagination. A doctor might recommend abstaining from intercourse during certain phases of the moon, or avoiding conception during particular astrological alignments, just in case the child might be born under a cursed star. And yet, despite all the rules and moral warnings, people continued to quietly manage their fertility as best they could. Life was short, resources were scarce, and no one wanted more mouths to feed than they could manage. It's easy to imagine a medieval woman sitting by the fire, mixing her herbs carefully, listening for footsteps, and hoping no one would accuse her of witchcraft. Because yes, using birth control could be taken as a sign of sorcery. Another reason these practices stayed hidden. By the 15th century, things were about to shift again. The Renaissance was dawning, bringing with it a renewed interest in science, anatomy, and medicine. Soon, Europe would rediscover classical texts and combine them with new observations, leading to even more recipes, more devices, and eventually the first printed books about sex and reproduction. But we'll save that for our next slow drift through history. Would you have trusted those medieval doctors and their moon charts? Or would you have stuck with the village midwife and her secret tea blends? Tell me what you think before we wander on into the bright, but still rather weird world of Renaissance contraception. So let's quietly step into the Renaissance, that supposedly shining rebirth of knowledge, art, and science. People were painting the Sistine Chapel, carving David out of marble, inventing perspective in painting. And yes, still try to figure out how not to have a child every single year. The rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman texts brought back a lot of old contraceptive knowledge, though some of it was as unreliable as ever. Doctors and scholars started copying and commenting on ancient herbal manuals, adding their own observations, sometimes with a bit more accuracy, sometimes with even more superstition. But overall, there was a renewed sense that human bodies could be studied, understood, and maybe controlled, which was good news for anyone not ready for a surprise baby. Herbal remedies were still the mainstay. The Renaissance woman could choose from an entire garden's worth of plants: pennyroyal rue, juniper berries, Queen Anne's lace, and the ever-popular silphium substitutes, though none were quite as effective as a lost original. Many of these herbs were brewed into teas, tinctures, or even pessaries, which were inserted before intercourse. There was an elegance to the practice, a sense of domestic ritual. You can almost imagine someone in a candlelit kitchen, carefully grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, muttering about her lazy husband and hoping the mixture would work this time. But the Renaissance also brought new inventions. Condoms made of animal intestine became more common, especially among wealthy and adventurous men. They were called armors or English riding coats, depending on who you asked, and they were surprisingly durable, reusable, even. One had to wash them carefully after use and hang them up to dry, which sounds about as romantic as you'd expect. But they were a step forward compared to linen sheaths. They were thinner, less likely to leak, and slowly became popular not only for disease prevention, but for contraception as well. This was the era of Casanova, after all, who reportedly used condoms often, and even wrote about them with a mixture of practicality and pride. He claimed to test them by inflating them with air to check for holes, a sort of Renaissance quality control. It's an oddly charming image, Casanova in some Venetian bedroom, holding a little inflated sheep-gut balloon and deciding whether it was safe enough for the night's adventures. The man may have been a shameless flirt, but he was at least committed to his craft. Meanwhile, physicians were busy writing down more and more elaborate advice on timing and observation. They believed that conception was more likely during certain phases of the menstrual cycle, which is true, though their exact calculations were often wrong. And so they began to recommend periods of abstinence to avoid pregnancy. These methods were not particularly accurate, but they marked an important shift toward trying to understand the female reproductive cycle scientifically. We also start to see early mechanical devices appear in this period. The first documented cervical caps and diaphragms, made of linen or leather and coated in wax or oil. They were handmade, bespoke, and certainly not mass-produced, but they represented yet another step toward modern contraception. Imagine the delicacy of sewing a tiny linen dome, meant to sit snugly in place, in an era when most people didn't even own more than a handful of outfits. Of course, the church was still not thrilled about any of this. Religious authorities wrote sternly against contraception, calling it sinful, unnatural, and a threat to the moral order. But, as usual, the people mostly ignored them when necessary. After all, the priests weren't the ones paying for bread for the 15th child. And so the quiet kitchen rituals, the herbal teas, and the careful washing and drying of sheep-gut condoms continued, night after night, generation after generation. There's something rather comforting about the Renaissance household. The candles flickering, the smell of herbs in the air, the sound of distant music from a lute drifting through the streets, and somewhere in the back room, a woman quietly making sure that tomorrow won't bring more than she can handle. It's not glamorous history, but it is deeply human. What would you have done? Trusted Casanova's air inflation method? Sewn your own little linen cap? Or brewed up a batch of pennyroyal tea and hoped the stars were aligned just right? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know what Renaissance solution you think you'd survive. As we drift toward the 17th century, things begin to look a little more familiar. The scientific revolution is stirring, microscopes are appearing, and soon someone will actually see sperm for the first time. But we'll save that moment of revelation for our next slow stretch through this winding, very human story. So now we drift gently forward into the 17th century, that era of powdered wigs, candlelit studies, and the slow, steady hum of the scientific revolution. People were starting to put the world under a microscope, literally, and they were just beginning to realize that reproduction was not governed by magic, moon phases, or the wrath of mischievous spirits, but by tiny living things and biological processes. Of course, it took them quite a while to put all the pieces together, and in the meantime, they kept coming up with new ways to avoid creating more children than they could feed. In 1677, a Dutch microscopist named Anthony van Leeuwenhoek peered through one of his handmade lenses and saw sperm for the first time. He described them as animalcules, tiny animals with little tails, swimming purposefully. This was a revelation and also a little alarming. Imagine finding out that every time a man so much as blinked in the wrong direction, there were millions of tiny, squirming creatures ready to start a family. The discovery sparked endless debates. Did these little swimmers contain tiny preformed humans, like homunculi just waiting to grow? Or did they somehow combine with the woman's contribution to make a child? Scientists argued about this for decades while people quietly kept using their sheep-gut condoms and herbal teas, trying not to have yet another baby. The early modern period brought refinement of barrier methods. Condoms made from animal intestines or bladder became thinner, softer, and somewhat more comfortable. They were still expensive and often used by the wealthy or by men visiting brothels rather than by ordinary couples. But they were spreading across Europe just the same. Some were even sold perfumed, which feels like an unexpectedly luxurious touch for someone that was, let's face it, still basically a cleaned-out piece of sheep intestine tied with a ribbon. People reuse them frequently, carefully washing and drying them, sometimes even storing them in special little cases. Family planning, but make it fancy. At the same time, more and more printed medical manuals began circulating. These books, written in Latin or sometimes in a local language, provided advice on avoiding conception, usually couched in terms of regulating the family or spacing children. They recommended timing intercourse carefully, using herbal pessaries, or taking cooling baths after the act. The advice was still hit or miss, but it marked a shift toward openly discussing contraception as a legitimate topic, at least in medical circles. This was also the era of early quack remedies. Traveling peddlers sold little packets of powders and potions, promising to prevent pregnancy or induce menstruation. Most of them were useless, some were dangerous, and a few might actually have worked if taken in just the right dose. But desperate people are willing to take risks, and so these remedies continue to find buyers. There were also devices, primitive syringes meant for douching, which physicians sometimes recommended after intercourse. The idea was that flushing the vagina with vinegar, wine, or even mercury solution could wash away sperm. This was not pleasant, not particularly safe, and not very effective, but it was yet another attempt in the never-ending quest to control fertility. Religious and moral objection, of course, did not go away. Preachers and pamphleteers warned that contraception was a sin, an insult to God's plan. But as the early modern world grew more urban and more crowded, people increasingly ignored those warnings. They had practical concerns. Feeding 10 children in a cramped London tenement was not exactly anyone's dream life. So the quiet use of condoms, herbal teas, and homemade devices spread, even if no one admitted it publicly. One of the more fascinating things about this period is how contraception began to intersect with early feminist thought. Some writers began to argue that women had a right to control their own bodies, that they should not be condemned to endless pregnancies against their will. These ideas were still radical, still whispered rather than shouted, but they were there, taking root, waiting for the right moment in history to bloom. If you had lived in the 17th century, what would you have done? Would you have trusted the sheep-gut condom, bought a packet of mysterious powder from the traveling apothecary, or tried the vinegar douche recommended by the doctor with the extremely questionable mustache? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know which of these you think you'd survive without too much complaint. As we move gently toward the 18th century, things will get even more interesting. Birth control literature will become more public. Condoms will become more available. And entire moral panics will erupt over whether too much contraception might be destroying the moral fabric of society. Spoiler, it wasn't, but we'll drift into that slowly, as we always do, letting the candles burn low and the powdered wigs gather just a little more dust. So now we drift into the 18th century, the era of Enlightenment salons, powdered faces, and coffee houses full of men arguing about liberty, reason, and whether or not the moon affected the tides of human behavior. It was a time when philosophers were busy drafting the blueprints for democracy and human rights, and ordinary people were just as busy figuring out how to avoid the chaos of another unexpected baby in a tiny apartment above the bakery. The Enlightenment loved reason, science, and progress, and naturally, it started to treat family planning as something that could be reasoned about too. Contraception became a slightly more public conversation, at least in the printed word. Pamphlets circulated that discussed preventing conception in coded, careful language, sometimes disguised as medical advice, sometimes as moral guidance to the responsible head of household. Condoms, still made from sheep intestine, were increasingly sold through apothecaries and even advertised discreetly in newspapers. They were expensive, yes, but at last they were becoming accessible to more than just the wealthy libertines. Some were even decorated with colored ribbons at the open end, because clearly what everyone wanted was just a little touch of style in the middle of a very practical moment. And speaking of style, the 18th century was also the heyday of Casanova, who, as I mentioned before, took birth control very seriously. His memoirs are full of charmingly matter-of-fact descriptions of using condoms, which he considered an essential part of his toolkit. He even joked that they were armor against Venus, which is probably the most poetic way anyone has ever described a sheep intestine. It's almost endearing to imagine him, somewhere in Venice, gently tying a little ribbon and feeling that he was doing his part for science. Outside of Italy, other countries were busy having their own debates about contraception. In England, birth control pamphlets were published under mysterious pen names, offering advice to married couples who wanted to limit their families. Some writers even argued that it was a moral duty to avoid too many children if one could not provide for them, turning the church's argument on its head. Of course, not everyone agreed. There were moralists who saw this as a threat to society, warning that contraception would lead to idleness, vice, and the downfall of civilization. This has been a popular prediction for centuries, and civilization stubbornly keeps surviving. In France, meanwhile, the nobility were busy trying to look elegant while also quietly managing their heirs. The aristocracy had their own discreet midwives and physicians who offered advice on herbal methods, pessaries, and timing strategies. Family planning was not just a practical matter, but a dynastic one. The future of estates, titles, and alliances often depended on careful control of reproduction. Behind the glittering chandeliers and powdered wigs, there were plenty of quiet calculations about who should be born and when. By the late 18th century, condoms were being produced in larger quantities, sometimes even advertised openly, though always with euphemisms. One London shop boasted that it sold French letters, a term that would survive well into the 20th century. These early mass-produced condoms were not cheap, but they could be bought by ordinary people if they were willing to save up a bit, an early sign that contraception was slowly becoming democratized. This was also the age of the first serious population theories. Thomas Malthus, writing in the 1790s, warned that human population would always grow faster than food supplies, leading to famine and misery unless people practiced moral restraint. By moral restraint, he mostly meant abstinence, but other readers took his ideas as a good reason to quietly promote contraception as well. The conversation was shifting. Fertility was no longer just a private matter. It was becoming a public, even political, topic. And as always, there were the quack remedies. Traveling salesmen still offered powders, herbs, and potions, many of them completely ineffective. Advertisements promised female regulation, a polite way of saying, "will bring on your period," which could mean anything from a mild tea to a poison. It was a risky business. But for many women, it was the only option, especially if they had no access to condoms or medical help. What would you have done in this century of reason and ribbons? Would you have trusted the apothecary's French letter, saved up for a pair or two, or brewed up one of those mysterious female teas and hoped for the best? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know which Enlightenment method you think you'd have survived without too much trouble. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, contraception was about to become even more widely available, but also more controversial. The Victorians were waiting just around the corner, with their tightly laced corsets, moral panic, and strange obsession with classifying everything, including sexual behavior. We'll slip quietly into that world next, letting the gaslights flicker on and the sound of carriage wheels clatter on cobblestones as we enter the most repressed and yet most oddly inventive century for contraception. Here we are in the 19th century, a century of steam engines, smog, and so many layers of fabric that just getting dressed required its own support team. The Victorians are often remembered as prudish, buttoned up, and horrified by the very idea of ankles. And to be fair, they did have a lot of opinions about ankles. But the truth is that this era was also a busy time for innovation in, of all things, birth control. It's always slightly funny to imagine that while Queen Victoria was ruling over the largest empire in history, someone, somewhere, was quietly trying to market a new and improved diaphragm. The Victorians were obsessed with morality, but they were also deeply pragmatic. Industrial cities were crowded, children were expensive, and not everyone could afford 12 of them running around the soot-stained streets of Manchester. Contraception was increasingly framed as a way to promote family health and economic stability, though no one ever said this too loudly in polite society. Middle-class advice manuals sometimes hinted at methods of marital prudence, which was a genteel way of saying maybe don't have a baby every year. Condoms became easier to produce thanks to Charles Goodyear's invention of vulcanized rubber in 1839. This meant that instead of carefully washing and drying a fragile sheep intestine sheath, which, let's be honest, probably took some of the romance out of the whole process, couples could now purchase reusable rubber condoms. They were sturdier, easier to clean, and yes, still tied with a ribbon at the end. The Victorians may have been anxious about sex, but they still liked a little decorative flourish. And because this was a Victorian age, they had to argue about it. Religious leaders warned that contraception would lead to moral decay and social collapse. Doctors debated whether it was healthy or dangerous. Some reformers argued that family limitation would improve society, allowing working-class families to escape poverty. Others insisted that it would lead to selfishness and decline. The whole topic was a minefield of pamphlets, sermons, and parliamentary debates, with everyone insisting they had the moral high ground. In the midst of this, early birth control advocates began to emerge. Charles Knowlton in America and Annie Besant in England were among the first to publicly promote contraception as a moral good. Besant, in particular, became a major figure after she was tried in court for publishing a pamphlet called The Fruits of Philosophy, which explained reproductive biology and methods of birth control in surprisingly plain language for the time. The trial became a sensation and helped bring the issue into the public eye, even as critics tried to shame and silence her. Despite all the moralizing, contraception quietly became part of many couples' lives. Rubber condoms were sold through chemists and mail-order catalogs, though often under euphemistic names like male shields or prophylactics. Pessaries and diaphragms were available for women who could access a cooperative doctor or midwife. And yes, people still relied on herbal methods, withdrawal, and timing, though now they had printed charts and advice columns to consult. What's striking about the Victorian era is how much it was about appearances. Couples might have used contraception, but they weren't supposed to talk about it. The official story was still one of propriety and self-control, but behind closed doors, people were making careful choices about the size of their families. If you read Victorian novels closely, you sometimes catch little hints. A character with only 2 children instead of 8, a reference to ill health that conveniently lasted just long enough to avoid a new baby. These were subtle signs that contraception was becoming a quiet, if not fully respectable, part of life. And of course, there were the inevitable moral panics. Some critics worried that contraception would encourage promiscuity, undermine marriage, and allow women to rebel against their natural duty. This is the same century that gave us the idea that too much education could make women infertile, so it's not surprising that some people saw family planning as dangerous. But others saw it as liberating, a way for women to have some control over their bodies and for families to escape crushing poverty. Would you have dared to walk into a Victorian chemist and ask for a packet of male shields? Or would you have trusted a timing chart and hoped for the best? Tell me in the comments how bold you think you'd have been with a society full of neighbors ready to gossip about your choices. As we drift out of the Victorian age and into the early 20th century, the topic of contraception will only grow louder, more political, and more controversial. The invention of the rubber condom was just the beginning. Soon, social reformers, suffragists, and scientists would turn family planning into a global movement. So let's stroll gently onward, leaving behind the foggy gaslit streets and stepping into the electric light of a new century, where birth control will become a rallying cry for change. So now we find ourselves at the turn of the 20th century. The streets are lit with electric lamps. Trains whistle in the distance, and the world feels as though it's speeding up. Factories are roaring, cities are growing, and medical science is suddenly everywhere, peering into germs, discovering vitamins, and very tentatively trying to understand the human reproductive system in a way that didn't involve Latin euphemisms and blushing. Contraception, of course, was coming along for the ride, though still wrapped in a good deal of scandal. The early 1900s were a time of reform. Suffragists were marching for women's right to vote, labor organizers were fighting for fair wages, and public health reformers were trying to clean up urban slums. Somewhere in this whirlwind was a growing belief that women should have a say in whether or not they became pregnant. This was a quietly radical idea, and like all radical ideas, it was greeted with outrage from many quarters. Politicians worried it would destabilize society. Clergy denounced it as immoral. Newspapers debated it endlessly, which only helped spread the message further. One of the most famous figures of this era was Margaret Sanger, an American nurse who became the face of the birth control movement. She was bold, outspoken, and absolutely unwilling to stop talking about contraception, even when the law told her to. In fact, the Comstock laws in the United States still classified contraceptive information as obscene, meaning it was illegal to send through the mail. Sanger decided to break this law deliberately, publishing pamphlets that explained contraception in plain, practical language. She was arrested for it, naturally, and rather than quietly backing down, she used her trials as publicity for the cause. Meanwhile, in Europe, family planning was also becoming a more public discussion. Clinics opened in Britain, the Netherlands, and Germany, offering information and even distributing contraceptives. Some reformers saw this as a way to improve public health and reduce poverty, framing contraception as a social good rather than a moral failing. It was still controversial, but slowly, the idea that people could and should have control over their fertility was gaining ground. Condoms were now mass-produced from rubber, cheap enough that they could be sold in vending machines. Yes, vending machines, and at least somewhat reliable. Diaphragms and cervical caps were available to women who could get prescription, though this still required finding a doctor who approved of such things, which was not always easy. There were also spermicidal jellies, foams, and suppositories being developed, though their effectiveness was, well, let's just say it was variable. And yet, despite these advances, much of the conversation remained under the surface. Couples often learned about contraception through word of mouth, whispered advice from a friend, or a discreet visit to a pharmacist. For many women, the first real discussion they ever had about birth control came not from a doctor, but from another woman, often someone a little older and bolder who was willing to share what she knew. This era was also the beginning of a larger conversation about sexual health more broadly. Syphilis and gonorrhea were widespread, and public health campaigns started to encourage condom use not just for preventing pregnancy, but also for preventing disease. This was a major shift. The condom was now a medical device, something endorsed by doctors and the military, which helped remove at least a little of its scandalous reputation. Of course, not everyone approved. There were fierce campaigns to suppress birth control information, and reformers were accused of undermining morality, marriage, and the nation itself. Some critics even claimed that declining birth rates would lead to national weakness, which, given that this was just before World War I, is darkly ironic. But the genie was out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back. If you had been alive in 1910, would you have risked sending away for a pamphlet through the mail, knowing it might be intercepted and get you in trouble? Or would you have relied on whispered advice and homemade methods, hoping no one noticed? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious whether you've been a quiet supporter or an outspoken rebel like Sanger. As we move deeper into the 20th century, contraception will become part of public policy, military planning, and even global politics. The wars of the 20th century will accelerate the conversation, and the interwar years will see new technology and new arguments about who should and who should not be allowed to reproduce. So let's drift onward into this complicated, fascinating, and sometimes troubling chapter as the world hurtles toward modern birth control. Now we drift into the early and mid-20th century, the years of the world wars, when entire nations were mobilized, borders redrawn, and ration books became as common as tea kettles. It might not sound like the best time to think about contraception, but in fact, these were years when governments became very interested in who was reproducing, how much, and when. Fertility had suddenly become a matter of national strategy. During the First World War, armies handed out condoms to soldiers, not necessarily to prevent pregnancy, but to stop the spread of sexually transmitted infections, which were a huge problem for military health. This made condoms, for perhaps the first time, almost respectable. After all, if they were good enough for the army, they must be a practical necessity. Returning soldiers often brought this attitude home with them, normalizing condom use among civilians and making contraception a little less taboo. The interwar years were also when eugenics became a fashionable topic in intellectual circles. Eugenics, the idea that society should control who reproduces in order to improve the human race, was embraced by some reformers, scientists, and unfortunately, quite a few governments. In practice, this often meant promoting contraception and even sterilization among the poor, the disabled, and marginalized groups, while encouraging larger families among those considered desirable. It was a deeply troubling chapter in reproductive history, and it reminds us that birth control was sometimes used as a tool of control rather than liberation. At the same time, family planning advocates were gaining ground. Clinics opened across Europe and North America, offering contraceptives and education. The London-based Marie Stopes clinics, founded by the tireless and often controversial Marie Stopes, provided advice and devices to married women, helping them space their pregnancies and avoid constant childbearing. Stopes was not shy about her views, publishing best-selling books that mixed practical advice with a certain amount of moralizing about the right kind of family. Then came the Second World War, and once again, contraception became part of military logistics. Condoms were standard issue for soldiers in nearly every army, and educational posters warned of the dangers of loose living and venereal disease. After the war, many countries faced a baby boom, but also an increase in conversations about family size, women's work, and access to contraception. The 1940s and 50s were a period of quiet tension. Traditional gender roles were being reasserted, but at the same time, there was a growing demand for reliable, safe birth control. Technological advances were continuing behind the scenes. Rubber condoms were thinner and stronger than ever, and diaphragms had been refined for better fit and effectiveness. Spermicidal jellies and foams were widely marketed, promising a discreet and convenient option for women. Magazines of the era, always careful with their language, began to publish advice columns that hinted at these options for modern wives. But the real breakthrough was still on the horizon: hormonal contraception. Researchers were working throughout the 1940s and 50s to isolate hormones and develop a pill that could reliably prevent ovulation. It was an ambitious goal. After all, they were essentially trying to switch off one of the body's most basic functions temporarily and safely. By the late 1950s, they were getting close, and the world was about to change dramatically. And yet, this was still a world where contraception could be illegal. In some places, including parts of the United States, it was actually against the law to distribute birth control or even information about it. Some couples had to cross state lines to visit clinics, and doctors risked arrest by prescribing contraceptives. It is a strange contradiction. Technology was racing forward, public demand was rising, but the legal system was still stuck in the 19th century. Would you have been one of the people writing quietly to a birth control clinic, risking your letter being opened and confiscated? Or would you have relied on what was available at the local pharmacy, hoping no one judged you for buying it? Tell me in the comments which side of the line you think you'd have stood on during this uneasy, transitional era. As we leave the shadow of the Second World War and move into the 1960s, we'll step into one of the most revolutionary moments in reproductive history: the arrival of the pill, the sexual revolution, and the beginning of a whole new conversation about freedom, feminism, and what family life could look like. Let's drift onward into the bright, technicolor world of the mid-20th century. Now we step gently into the 1960s, an era full of change: miniskirts, rock music, civil rights marches, and, quietly but profoundly, the arrival of the birth control pill. If the 19th century had been about whispering, the 1960s were about finally saying things out loud, though perhaps still with a nervous glance over the shoulder. The pill, as it quickly became known, was a tiny tablet that carried enormous implications. For the first time in history, women had a highly effective, discreet, and reversible method of preventing pregnancy. No ribbons, no boiling of rubber sheaths, no timing chart stuck to the back of the pantry door. Just a pill, taken once a day, that could quietly rewrite the course of a life. The pill was approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in 1960, and its release was met with equal parts celebration and alarm. Advocates hailed it as a breakthrough for women's freedom, arguing that it would allow them to finish school, enter the workforce, and plan their families with unprecedented control. Critics, on the other hand, warned that it would destroy morality, encourage promiscuity, and lead to the collapse of the family. As usual, both sides were convinced they were witnessing a revolution, and in a sense they were. Legal barriers began to fall, though not all at once. In some American states, it was still technically illegal to prescribe contraceptives to unmarried women, which led to some creative workarounds and a great deal of indignation. Court cases eventually struck down these laws, culminating in the famous Griswold versus Connecticut decision in 1965, which established a constitutional right to privacy in marital relations. For many couples, this was the first time contraception had been explicitly declared a legal right rather than a guilty secret. The 1960s and 70s were also the years of the so-called sexual revolution, when popular culture started talking about sex with a frankness that would have scandalized the Victorians. Music, film, and literature reflected a new openness, and contraception was part of that conversation. Public health campaigns promoted family planning. International organizations began distributing contraceptives worldwide, and birth rates started to fall in many countries. For some, this was proof that society was finally becoming enlightened. For others, it was a sign of moral decay. Technology kept advancing. New generations of the pill were formulated to reduce side effects. IUDs were developed and refined, and barrier methods became more comfortable and reliable. For the first time, couples had a genuine menu of choices, rather than a patchwork of half-effective folk remedies. It was an era of experimentation, not always perfect, but undeniably transformative. And yet, this period was not without backlash. Conservative religious groups fought against contraception, sometimes successfully lobbying to restrict funding for clinics or limit access to the pill. Some governments worried about declining birth rates and actually promoted larger families, reversing earlier efforts to encourage contraception. It was a reminder that control over reproduction has always been about more than just biology. It has been about power, politics, and culture. There were also concerns about the medical side of things. Early versions of the pill contained higher doses of hormones than modern ones, leading to reports of blood clots and other health risks. Feminist health activists in the 1970s began to demand more research, better information, and safer formulations. This was part of a larger movement for women's health, which insisted that contraception should not just be available but also safe, transparent, and respectful of women's needs. Would you have been one of the early adopters of the pill, eagerly lining up for a prescription despite the controversy? Or would you have been skeptical, waiting to see if it was safe before trusting it? Tell me in the comments which kind of 1960s contraceptive user you think you'd have been, the pioneer or the cautious observer. As we leave the neon glow of the 1970s and step into the 1980s and 90s, contraception will become both mainstream and strangely politicized. The global population conversation will heat up, new methods will appear, and the topic will get caught up in debates over everything from feminism to public funding. So let's drift onward into the late 20th century, where contraception becomes both ordinary and endlessly controversial at the same time. Now we step into the 1980s, a decade of shoulder pads, cassette tapes, and an ever-growing conversation about population health and who exactly should be in charge of reproduction. By now, contraception was widely available in much of the world, at least in theory. The pill had become a household name. IUDs were fairly common, and condoms could be bought at nearly any pharmacy without anyone batting an eye, though a few people still probably avoided eye contact with the cashier. This was also the age of global family planning programs. International organizations, worried about overpopulation, poured funding into contraceptive distribution, education campaigns, and clinics. Posters urged couples to have 2 or fewer children, often accompanied by cheerful illustrations of tidy, smiling families. Some governments took a particularly enthusiastic approach, offering incentives for sterilization or setting national targets for reducing birth rates. At its best, this helped families escape poverty and gave women a measure of control over their lives. At its worst, it sometimes became coercive, with people pressured or even forced into procedures they did not want. The 1980s also brought a new urgency to the conversation because of the HIV/AIDS crisis. Suddenly, condoms were no longer just about preventing pregnancy. They were a literal life-saving device. Public health campaigns around the world promoted condom use, often for the first time openly discussing sexual behavior that had previously been considered too private to mention. Television ads, posters, and school programs taught people how to use condoms correctly, making them perhaps the most famous and socially approved contraceptive method of all time. This public promotion, of course, sparked debates. Some critics claimed that encouraging condom use would encourage immorality, a concern that had been recycled in every century so far. Others argued that it was simply common sense to prevent disease and save lives. The result was an entire generation who grew up knowing far more about contraception, anatomy, and sexual health than their grandparents ever would have admitted to knowing. The 1990s brought even more innovation. Emergency contraception, sometimes called a morning-after pill, became available, providing an option for preventing pregnancy after unprotected intercourse. Hormonal implants, like Norplant, offered long-term contraception without a daily pill, while improved copper IDs gave women a non-hormonal option that could last for years. The range of choices kept expanding, allowing people to pick the method that worked best for their health, their lifestyle, and their comfort level. And yet, contraception remained controversial in many parts of the world. Legal battles continued over whether insurance should cover it, whether schools should teach about it, and whether pharmacists could refuse to provide it on moral grounds. The same tiny tablets and latex sheaths that quietly sat in medicine cabinets also sat at the center of heated debates about religion, politics, and gender roles. Popular culture also kept talking about contraception. Sitcoms joked about the pill, teen magazines published guides to safe sex, and musicians sang about taking control of one's body. By the late 1990s, contraception had become almost ordinary, no longer something whispered about, but also no longer something that felt especially revolutionary. It was simply part of life for millions of people. Would you have been one of the cautious 80s parents, sitting your kids down for a serious talk about safe sex? Or would you have relied on the school posters and let them figure out for themselves? Tell me in the comments how you think you'd have handled the era when contraception became a household topic rather than a hidden one. As we leave the 20th century and drift into the new millennium, contraception will continue to evolve, becoming even more discreet, more reliable, and more personalized. The 21st century will bring apps, implants, and entire social media movements, turning family planning into both a private decision and a public conversation all over again. So, let's quietly step forward into the present day and see how far we've come. And now we find ourselves in the early 2000s, a world of early smartphones, clunky internet connections, and a rise of a whole new way of sharing information. Contraception, like everything else, began to live online. No longer did someone have to walk nervously into a pharmacy or whisper questions to a friend. They could simply type them into a search engine at 2 a.m. and scroll through endless forums, articles, and advice columns. This made birth control more accessible than ever before, at least for those who had internet access and the privacy to use it. Technology was also transforming the methods themselves. Long-acting reversible contraception, LARCs for short, became increasingly popular. These included hormonal implants that could work for 3 to 5 years, as well as newer IUDs that were smaller, more comfortable, and highly effective. For many women, these were life-changing. Set it, forget it, and enjoy years of reliable protection without having to remember a daily pill. Emergency contraception also became widely available, sometimes even over the counter, leading to both relief and outrage. Supporters praised the convenience and the ability to prevent unplanned pregnancies after contraceptive failure. Critics worried it would be misused or encourage riskier behavior. Once again, contraception found itself at the center of public debates, proving that even in the 21st century, we still weren't entirely comfortable letting reproduction be just a personal matter. Meanwhile, apps and digital trackers turned fertility awareness into a high-tech option. People could log their cycles, track their temperature, and receive notifications predicting fertile days with a level of precision that medieval herbalists could only have dreamed of. Some users loved the sense of control and insight this provided. Others found it a bit stressful, a daily reminder of the invisible ticking clock that governed biology. Culturally, the 2000s and 2010s saw contraception discussed more openly than ever. Television shows portrayed characters taking the pill without fanfare. YouTube creators posted explainer videos about IUD insertions, and social media threads offer reviews of different methods, sometimes in far more detail than anyone asked for. The conversation had gone public, messy, honest, and sometimes very funny. This era also saw renewed fights over access. Legal battles reached the highest courts, debating whether employers had to cover contraception in health insurance plans, and whether pharmacists could refuse to dispense it. For many people, birth control became not just a medical choice, but a symbol of autonomy, equality, and sometimes defiance. Globally, progress was uneven. In some countries, contraceptive access expanded dramatically, helping to lower maternal mortality rates and improve education for girls. In others, barriers remained high, with social stigma, cost, or outright legal restrictions keeping contraception out of reach. The result was a patchwork map. Some places enjoying near-universal access, others still in a situation not far removed from the 19th century. Would you have been one of the early adopters of period tracking apps, watching charts and predictions on your flip phone? Or would you have preferred the old-fashioned approach, trusting the pill or the little foil packet from the pharmacy? Tell me in the comments how modern you think your method would have been in the early 2000s. As we leave this era and step quietly into the present day, contraception is poised to become even more advanced, with research exploring male contraceptives, remote prescriptions, and even reversible gene-level interventions. So let's take one more gentle step forward and see where all this long, strange history has brought us today, and where it might be going next. And now we arrive in the present, where contraception has become both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. On one hand, it is as simple as opening an app, ordering a refill online, or having a small, invisible implant placed in the arm. On the other, it is still the subject of fierce debate, with legislatures and courts deciding who should have access, how much it should cost, and who gets to make those choices. It seems that contraception has always lived at the intersection of the deeply personal and the loudly political, and the 21st century is no different. Research today is pushing into areas that earlier generations could hardly imagine. Scientists are working on safe, reversible male contraceptives, a goal that has been promised for decades but always seemed to remain just out of reach. Trials are exploring pills, gels, and injections that could temporarily switch off sperm production, sharing the responsibility of contraception more evenly between partners. Whether these will become widely available soon is still uncertain, but the fact that we are so close is remarkable in itself. There are also developments in non-hormonal contraception, designed to avoid the side effects that some people experience with hormonal methods. Researchers are exploring everything from antibodies that target sperm to tiny mechanical devices that block reproductive pathways. The future may hold methods that are even more effective, safer, and completely reversible, almost like science fiction becoming reality. Social media has also transformed the conversation. People share experiences with every method imaginable, offer support for side effects, and compare notes on doctors and clinics. A single post about a difficult IUD insertion can spark thousands of comments, turning private struggles into public knowledge that helps others make informed choices. This openness is new. Previous generations simply endured these challenges in silence or whispered about them behind closed doors. Of course, access is still uneven. For some, contraception is free, easy, and private. For others, it is expensive, difficult to obtain, or socially frowned upon. The same world that could deliver a birth control pill subscription to your doorstep can also make it nearly impossible for someone in another region to access even the most basic contraceptives. And so we find ourselves, in this present moment, at the end of a very long and complicated history. We have traveled from ancient crocodile dung and bronze pessaries to apps that predict ovulation to the very hour. We have seen royal courts that panicked over heirs, empires that rose and fell based on who could have children, and millions of ordinary people quietly trying to control their own lives in whatever way they could. Would you have been one of the first to sign up for a trial of male contraception, curious to see how well it worked? Or would you prefer to wait until it had been tested for a decade or two before trusting it? Tell me in the comments how adventurous you think you'd be with the contraception of the future. And with that, we have slowly drifted through thousands of years of history, through myths, mistakes, experiments, and revolutions. If you made it this far, congratulations. You've just taken a 2-hour journey through one of humanity's most intimate and fascinating struggles. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this calm trip through history, give a like so I know to make more of these. Share it with a friend who loves strange history facts. And of course, subscribe so you can drift off with me on our next late night adventure. And before you go, tell me in the comments, which era's contraceptive method would you absolutely refuse to try, no matter what? Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the weight of all those centuries slowly fade away.